So last summer in Seattle, there were calls to completely defund and abolish the police, contrary to people telling you that nobody's saying they want to abolish the police. This article on Medium was put together by the organizations in question that were participating in the protests. This is back from June 9, 2020. The demands of the collective black voices at Free Capitol Hill to the government of Seattle, Washington. In credit to the people who freed Capitol Hill, this list of demands is neither brief nor simplistic. This is no simple request to end police brutality. We demand that the city council and the mayor, whoever that may be, implement these policy changes for the cultural and historic advancement of the city of Seattle, and to ease the struggle of its people. This document is to represent the black voices who spoke in victory at the top of 12th and Pine after 9 days of peaceful protest while under constant nightly attack from the Seattle Police Department. These are the words from that night, June 8, 2020. For the ease of consideration, we've broken these demands into 4 categories: the justice system, health and human services, economics, and education. So I'm not going to read this whole thing. I'm basically just going to be reading what pertains to the video that I'm doing here. However, I will provide a link in the description. Given the historical moment, we'll begin with our demands pertaining to the justice system. 1. The Seattle Police Department and attached court system are beyond reform. We do not request reform. We demand abolition. We demand that the Seattle Council and the mayor defund and abolish the Seattle Police Department and the attached criminal justice apparatus. This means 100% of funding, including existing pensions for Seattle police. At an equal level of priority, we also demand that the city disallow the operations of ICE in the city of Seattle. 2. In the transitionary period between now and the dismantlement of the Seattle Police Department, we demand that the use of armed force be banned entirely. No guns, no batons, no riot shields, no chemical weapons, especially against those exercising their First Amendment right as Americans to protest. 3. We demand an end to the school-to-prison pipeline and the abolition of youth jails. Get kids out of prison and get cops out of the schools. We also demand that the new youth prison being built in Seattle currently be repurposed. Now, scooting down here a little bit to one that's a little bit more relevant, 13, we demand the abolition of imprisonment, generally speaking, but especially for the abolition of both youth prisons and privately owned for-profit prisons. We demand, number 14, in replacement of the current justice system, the creation of restorative, transformative accountability programs as replacement for imprisonment. We demand, 19, we demand the funding previously used for Seattle police to be redirected to socialized health and medicine for the city of Seattle, free public housing, because housing is a right, not a privilege, public education to decrease the average class size in city schools and increase teacher salary, naturalization services for immigrants to the United States living here undocumented. We demand they be called undocumented because no person is illegal, general community development, parks, and etc. So, I don't really know how any of this is supposed to solve the crime problem that's going to happen, particularly since something that I predicted would happen is already starting to happen. Now, before I get into what I predicted was going to happen, first we can talk about the problems that are already going on in Seattle and why I think that the idea of defunding and abolishing the police in Seattle is kind of ridiculous. You know, they already had their opportunities to try to prove that any of this work when they did their CHAZ chop experiment where, you know, people were getting killed and raped and there wasn't really anything being done about it. But in 2020, Seattle had the most homicides it's had in 26 years. A sharp rise in murders across the country is alarming police departments, including in Seattle. Seattle, a national sharp rise in murders is alarming police departments across the country. In 2020, the city saw highest number of homicides in over 26 years. Basically, in 2019, there were 31 homicides. In 2020, that number increased by 61%. So the crime rates are already going up on their own, and this is without abolishing your police departments. So one of the concerns that I've had in discussing this matter with people who are pro-abolish or even defund the police is there generally seems to be a very troubling, complete lack of understanding of just how dangerous the criminal elements are that will be happy to fill the power vacuum if you defund or abolish the police. And exactly as I predicted, in the places where this is taking place, the cartel has taken notice and is interested in moving in. Let's take a second and watch this video.
I told you about the alarming amount of illicit fentanyl being seized throughout Seattle and the Pacific Northwest. Now, while there are many homegrown pill makers and dealers here, violent Mexican drug cartels are also moving in and gaining a foothold in the region, according to Homeland Security investigations. Federal agents tell us there's one group in particular that's trafficking the most.
They operate in Mexico, up and down the United States, and all throughout Washington state.
I would say that they are a huge threat to the stability of this region.
We're talking about the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, also known as CJNG. In this recent...
Now I want to take a second to note, this isn't the Mexican police. This isn't the militarized police that you're concerned about in the United States. This is actually the people that are the reason why the militarized police of the United States exist. When you're looking at this, these are, some of these vehicles are armored, but again, these are criminals. These are not, government forces at all.
Released video, they flaunt their armored vehicles and high-powered weaponry in Mexico, a country where even a pistol is illegal for a law-abiding citizen to own, while praising their boss, El Mencho, the most wanted criminal in Mexico and one of the most wanted here in the United States.
The display of weapons shows one thing, but if you go back and look at the actual what they've done with those weapons, what they've done with the mass killings, what they've done with the destruction of a human, to convey their message that they are not to be messed with.
Homeland Security Special Agent in Charge Robert Hammer says like most cartels, CJNG spreads their fear through intimidation, through the infliction of extreme pain and torturous death.
So whether it's ripping the fingernails out of somebody's hands and as sending a message to them, or tying them up in a tree in the middle of central Washington to die, or dismembering them and shipping their remains off. They're there to deliver an effective message, which is don't mess with us.
Federal law enforcement says CJNG is now the main organization trafficking fentanyl into the U.S. across our southern border and into our region via the I-5 corridor. The fentanyl said to be 50 times more deadly than the heroin it's replacing throughout the Pacific Northwest.
We're seeing cartel activity, it's not limited to just the Seattle region. We're seeing large cartel activity in Middle Washington. We're seeing cartel activity in Southeast Washington.
In July of 2020, federal agents here in the Puget Sound region seized 200 fentanyl pills, 20 pounds of methamphetamine, heroin, cocaine, 9 firearms, and more than $250,000 in cash. 19 drug traffickers tied to CJNG were arrested, 15 indicted following an 18-month investigation. Just before that, law enforcement seized 1,500 fentanyl pills, more than 100 pounds of meth, various quantities of cocaine, heroin, and 6 firearms. And in March of this year, HSI's Narcotics Task Force, along with SPD detectives, seized 410,000 fentanyl pills, 77 pounds of meth, 908 grams of heroin, and 787 grams of cocaine, while serving several warrants in Bellevue.
I think it's something that should be eye-opening to some of the stories that have taken place across this region. Again, it's not limited to just downtown Seattle. This is really a regional problem that we've seen with the cartel activity, and it's requiring a multifaceted approach by law enforcement to really get after it.
In fiscal year 2020, Homeland Security Investigations tells me agencies 6,105 pounds of fentanyl across the country and made 31,915 criminal arrests. In just the first 4 months of this year here in the Pacific Northwest, HSI has seized 131 pounds of fentanyl. Last year, agencies 50 pounds, and 2019, just 4.
So I know people are concerned about police brutality. You don't want to be one of the statistics. Essentially, you're concerned that you might be one of the 1,000 or so people who die nationwide at the hands of police, a number not adjusted for legitimate shootings. But the kinds of people that will be happy, again, to take advantage of the power vacuum that will be created if you abolish your police are definitely worse than anything you're going to experience when it comes to police violence. The cartel brutally murdered and tortured 2 children. A 14-year-old boy and a 12-year-old boy were tortured and murdered for not obeying the cartel, basically doing something that pissed them off. And this is pretty common. They have zero qualms with murdering children. They behead people on TV. It's basically like having a drug-dealing ISIS occupy your country. And as I pointed out earlier, they're extremely well armed, well funded, and they're not going to stop. And in fact, they would love it if you abolish the police. Now, even with defunding the police, you're essentially going to create a circumstance in which the police are not going to be able to handle what would come next. From The Guardian, cowed and outgunned, why Mexico's police don't stand a chance against drug cartels. The 14th of October massacre that left 13 state police dead was just one extreme episode of violence in a recent litany of horrors. At first glance, the human skull lying beside the road looked like a piece of rubbish. Once spotted, it was impossible to ignore. Charred, broken, and punched through with a bullet hole. Around it, a carpet of bullet casings was scattered across the street, which runs through the middle of the village of El Aguije. I'm not going to be able to pronounce this, my apologies, but in Mexico's western state of Michoacan. Bones and bullets bore witness to the intensity of a ferocious cartel ambush, which 2 days earlier had killed 13 state police officers and wounded 9. It was so crazy to send them there like that, said a young mother who lives a block away from the ambush and asked not to be named. They were sent to the slaughter. And the fact that more than 48 hours after the attack, human remains and ballistic evidence still lay in the open suggested that any investigation of the crime scene had been cursory and carried out in a state of panic. The 14th October massacre was just one of the most extreme episodes of violence in recent litany of horrors from Mexico's drug wars. 4 days later, gunmen from another cartel mounted an even bigger show of firepower in the northern city of Culiacan, rescuing the son of jailed drug lord El Chapo after he was captured by troops. I'll give a link to this article, but basically this video shows what looks like something going on in like Beirut or Lebanon, but it wasn't. It was literally just a fight between the police and the cartel. But the ambush has shown a spotlight on Mexico's local police forces, which under the hands-off security strategy of President Obrador had been saddled with the fight against organized crime groups in many of the country's most dangerous regions. Cowed, outgunned, and enmeshed in alliances with criminal groups, Mexico's state and local police are clearly not up to the job. So I don't know what you think your social workers and safety officials are going to do when people like this show up to, open up shop. It's just not a practical solution. There isn't any number of the social programs or welfare programs that are going to solve this problem. And I'm sure that those of you who have allowed yourselves to be brainwashed enough to just completely hate the police probably take some kind of satisfaction in this idea. But as I showed you earlier, the kind of people that they were trying to stop murder women and children brutally, in a fashion far worse than anything that typically happens in police brutality incidents in the United States. Here's another example. Worse than any horror film, inside a Los Angeles cartel kitchen, an estimated 60,000 people disappeared in Mexico's drug wars. Some were cooked in ovens. Bloody handprints on the walls, stained clothes, plastic cable ties, machetes. As one person observes, the crunch of bones beneath a thick blanket of ash. Amid sobbing families of some of Mexico's estimated 60,000 disappeared, absorbed the scene at La Galera Ranch in northern Veracruz. A few meters from an abandoned single-story house, an outdoor brick oven was once used to make the traditional corn dish, zacuil. After the Los Zetas cartel took over the ranch in 2011, however, it was used to incinerate its victims. In this part of Mexico, someone explains brutality has stained language to zacuil can now mean to cook humans. In one of 12 kitchens recently discovered by families in northern Veracruz, volunteers and forensic examiners in white protective suits and face masks used sieves to search for fragments of human bones, teeth, and nails in mounds of compacted gray ash. Los Zetas, originally founded by Mexican Special Forces deserters with some U.S. training, started as the enforcement arm of the Gulf Cartel, a crime group of northwestern Mexico, before breaking away. While Los Zetas has itself fragmented, it is known for torture, beheadings, and massacres of civilians. More than 250,000 people have been killed since former President Felipe Calderon launched the so-called drug war in 2006, a conflict of shifting alliances and ever-increasing numbers of armed groups, dogged by persistent allegations that elements of the Mexican state are deeply intertwined with organized crime. Mexican government figures indicate that at least 60,000 people have been disappeared since 2006. Yet a 2015 report by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights found only 6 federal court convictions for the crime of forced disappearance. Disappearances have been carried out by state forces, crime groups, or both together, with motives including kidnapping, people for sex slavery, organ harvesting, forced labor, ransoms, repression of political activists and journalists, and gender-based violence. Now, the reason this in particular is very important is that one of the most prevalent arguments that I get when I'm discussing this issue is they say, well, just decriminalize drugs and all of this goes away, as if these people are going to stop, sex trafficking, organ harvesting. They're not. Indicative of the state's inability or unwillingness to take action, this most recent search at La Galera was initiated by the 5th National Search Brigade for the Disappeared, a grassroots initiative of families and volunteers. Escorted by heavily armed federal troops, the brigade spent 2 weeks in February searching northern Veracruz for hidden and mass graves, as well as the living disappeared in prisons, hospitals, and in the streets. So, I'll also provide a link to this article as well, but basically the kinds of people that will show up to take control if you get rid of your police departments or even just underfund them are far worse than your worst nightmare of what police brutality could look like. And as I predicted, they essentially smell blood in the water, like the sharks that they are, and they recognize that if you are stupid enough to abolish your police department, that they're going to be able to move in. They're finding their way all the way up to the top of Washington. You don't have a solution for this. This problem is not going to go away because you hired more social workers. And if I guess one of the, trying to figure out the best way to articulate this without being profane, but you just have to be a completely naive person or someone who just doesn't know what the hell they're talking about to think that this criminal situation is going to get any better because you abolish the police and set up some social programs. So one of the most absurd and fallacious arguments I typically hear from the abolish the police crowd is that police do not prevent crime. Essentially, they suggest that, cops only show up after the fact and then they don't do anything about it. I was actually involved in a conversation about this on a Facebook group before I got banned for daring to argue with them about it. So I had to kind of look around Facebook for some more examples of these kinds of idiotic arguments, but this was in response to something being posted in Abolish the Police hashtag, but this guy gave an example. Why do we need police? Israel Keyes, serial killer, rapist, arsonist, 11 killed, and 1 child rape. This person says, how exactly did the police figure into this? They obviously did not prevent these horrors. And I said, because he was finally caught by police, who then prevented him from killing anyone else by putting him in jail. This is the basic premise of this counter-argument, which is to say that suggesting the police do not prevent crime essentially, I guess, assumes that everybody who offends just wouldn't reoffend. We can just let criminals do their thing, and especially if you remember my last video, I pointed out that abolish the police movements also want to abolish prisons, and they don't really have any solutions that actually make any sense for how to deal with serious criminals like organized criminals. But I want to get to the core of this issue, which is to say that the argument that police do not prevent crime essentially leaves out the fact that police do investigate crime, police do arrest people, and those people go to jail so they can't re-offend. This is pretty simple. I've actually been kind of astonished looking over conversations like this because they're everywhere. And there are a lot of people who make these points. One of the people who was arguing in the Facebook group I got banned from earlier, was just saying, well, arrest records are destroying people's lives. They can't get jobs and they can't, get homes because of their offenses. And when I asked the guy repeatedly, okay, so then what do we do with actually violent criminals? He wouldn't answer me. It was pretty much all about, I'm assuming, his problems that came about because he got arrested and it's causing problems for him in his life. There's an excellent solution for this. Stop committing crime. The idea that we should just abolish the police because we don't want to have criminal records is just ridiculous. There's just no justifiable way to make that argument. But that's really what it's typically about. People are only thinking about this in the context of how it would directly affect them. As far as they don't want to be arrested, they don't want to have criminal records. But they're not considering that there are other people there who would, quite happily commit crime against them. And it's really short-sighted, and the kinds of people who are just dedicated to this get very emotional about it, who are not thinking, is staggeringly high. I can't believe that there are so many people that buy into this. And there's a lot of misinformation, which is fairly typical about anything that is being pushed right now from either the right or the left. But here's an example. One of the people in this conversation argued, well, Camden, New Jersey, abolished their police, and they're doing just fine. Now, Camden, New Jersey did make some improvements, but for one thing, they didn't abolish their police. They reformed their police, and they reformed their police's, basically systems. They did train them in de-escalation tactics, but they also increased their surveillance capabilities so that they're catching more criminals. And then they hired even more police. So they didn't abolish police and then just simply, let everybody do whatever they wanted. And Camden is actually not a good place to live. So for example, in comparison to other places in New Jersey, these are the crime analytics. If 100 is the safest, Camden is rated 6. Safer than 6% of U.S. cities. Number of crimes here per 1,000 residents, as you can see. Violent crime comparison per 1,000 residents, Camden, 15.78 as compared to the rest of New Jersey, 2.07. Your chances of becoming a victim of a violent crime, 1 in 63 in Camden, 1 in 483 in New Jersey. So I can link this later, but the point is that Camden didn't just turn into some beautiful utopia when they reformed their police department. And people who live there are actually suspecting that it's likely that the crimes are just not getting reported. I mean, crimes per square mile, national median is 28.3, Camden's is 317, and as compared to 56 in New Jersey. So Camden is still a cesspool of crime, and they didn't abolish their police. So people talking about this are just lying or ignorant. Here's another good example of a conversation about this. Somebody points out in a counterpoint, imagine 2 armed gunmen come into your child's school and start shooting. Solution, text 311 and a trained therapist will talk the gunman out of shooting what's left of the school children. And some of the replies are just unintelligent. I'm not actually going to try to argue. And then this person says, there would still be 911, there would still be armed police, just not for every call. Not if you actually abolish the police. There's a lot of confusion as to the terms in regards to the situation because, for one thing, the defund the police people just lie and say that nobody's saying abolish the police. They seem to be backing off of that a little bit because there's just too much evidence. I think the most blatant example was when Antifa showed up after the Breonna Taylor ruling with literal riot gear, pun intended, with giant banners that said abolish the police. So I guess we're over that. But, so then this person, Marissa Falls, says, yeah, so guess how many school shootings resource officers have stopped? Literally 0, even though they are armed and walk around the schools every single day. So try again. If you don't think these ideas would work, and you took the concept entirely out of context, at least defend the one you so praise. So I replied with, this took me about 5 minutes on Google, and I can share these if you guys want to see them, but armed SRO student, middle school shooting, basically this guy stopped the shooting. Lone resource officers, quick action, stopped a shooting in Maryland. Resource officer guns down school shooter. Hero officer stopped Florida school shooter in 3 minutes. Minnesota student fires gun in the middle school. And this actually ended in the school resource officer de-escalating and he didn't have to shoot the kid. Here's another one. School resource officer stopped Dixon's school shooting. So people are just repeating absolute horse shit, like suggesting that no school resource officer has ever stopped a school shooting. It's just wrong. It's not true. But it's another example of people spreading bullshit misinformation in this conversation. Now, ironically, I actually found, left-leaning articles, because Vox is by far on the left, the case for hiring more police officers. So they basically cite in this article that studies have been done, and that if you do have more beat cops, so in fact, I'll just read part of it. Solid data suggests that even if you take a realistic view of the police, spending money to hire more police officers, an idea espoused by both Presidents Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, is a sound approach to the multifaceted problem of criminal justice. More police officers in particular doesn't need to mean more arrests and more incarceration. More beat cops walking the streets seems to deter crime and reduce the need to arrest anyone, and some of the best validated approaches to reducing excessive use of force by police officers require departments to adopt more manpower-intensive practices. Basically, and they actually give links in some of these articles to the studies in question, having more cops on the beat prevents crime because people don't want to just commit crime in front of police officers. And if there's an ongoing police presence, it's just like anything else. Even kids behave badly, far more often if there's no adult supervision in the area. It's that simple. So, in other words, this is Vox. This is not like, a Fox News propaganda piece. This is literally a Vox article pointing out, that having more police on the beat, has the effect of less crime, period. Now, there are some arguments to be made as far as like, the insider points out that, U.S. police don't end up solving most crimes. At least that's what they suggest. But the federal government data from 2018 shows that just 46% of all violent crimes reported where police were cleared with an arrest, and 18% of property crimes were cleared. Beyond that, only an estimated 43% of people who were the victims of violent crimes recorded the incidents to the police in the first place, reported them. So, if only 46%, that's a little under half. So we should just not have police so that 100% of the violent crimes go unsolved or, undealt with? It just, especially again, remember what they said, Black Lives Matter wants to end prisons and end police. And, there have been some discussions about maybe adding some social programs, but that isn't going to solve all of the problems. Only 62% of murders and 33% of rapes are solved. So again, would you rather it was 100? No system like this is going to be perfect. And part of the problem is that, one of the things that just frequently happens on Facebook is they just say the cops do nothing. I called and reported that I was assaulted, the cops did nothing. The reality is that crimes are investigated, but if they don't have anything to go on, then they can't solve them. But the suggestion that therefore we don't need police at all to solve 62% of murders and 30-50% of rapes, it just doesn't make any sense. And to suggest that arresting 62% of murderers doesn't prevent crime is just ridiculous. It's not a defensible position. It makes no sense at all. So, anyway, to kind of wrap this up, if somebody tells you that police don't prevent crime, you need to point out to them the very basic point, which is that criminals who do get arrested, and, you know, that was another point I brought up, because they bring up things like, you know, I reported a burglary in my house and nothing happened, so therefore police don't do anything about burglaries, is an excellent example of anecdotal, not in any way provable stupidity. Because if that were the case, there wouldn't be anybody in prison for burglary, and there are thousands of people in prison for burglary. So just keep that in mind. The suggestion that they don't prevent crime just kind of leaves out the reality that we have people in prison for committing crimes. So let's first of all not pretend like there haven't been opportunities for people to prove that this could work. And I'll give you the first example that comes to mind was the Seattle CHAZ CHOP. Basically an autonomous zone taken over by protesters, and they would not allow police to be there. That was their thing. It ended up being more of an anarchist experiment, I would say. And one of the things in particular that I would say it really proved was that being a police officer is not as easy as people think. Because their police, ironically, were walking around armed with AR-15s and were, like, there's actually a video of one of them just punching somebody for getting on their nerves. But more than that, the CHAZ, or rather the CHOP, experienced 4 shootings in 10 days. A 16-year-old and a 19-year-old died in the shootings, and 4 other people were shot, including a 14-year-old boy. Following the 3rd shooting, the mayor and now former Seattle police chief, Carmen Best, announced the city's intention to dismantle the CHOP. So, I've seen some footage of some of this stuff, and basically, in one of the instances in particular, they mistook a vehicle for the vehicle that they were looking for and then just lit it up with gunfire from their ARs. And, you know, they killed an innocent person who wasn't the person that they were looking for. You know, in the other situation, there was 2 people who, I guess, got involved in a shooting, and then they couldn't get the police. Basically, they wouldn't let the police come in to help anybody, and then they refused the police, but then they sat there begging the ambulance to come in and do something. I can tell you that paramedics are not going to go to a war zone without police escort. Period. And who could blame them? They, of course, blamed it on racism, but it's standard procedure. Paramedics don't go to a shooting without a police escort. And considering how ineffective the CHAZ police proved at being at protecting anybody, suggesting to the paramedics that they could just rely on what amounted to just street gangs to protect them in the zone is just silly. You know, so they had their opportunity, and the shootings are just like the icing on the cake. There was also several rapes, you know, all kinds of different stuff that went on with no way to investigate it, no way to handle it. And it's just, you know, they had their opportunity to prove it, and they failed. 10 days, 4 shootings, you know, all of this happens, and people get killed in the name of trying to protest against somebody being killed by police. Doesn't make any sense. Now I'm going to play an excerpt on one of my own videos on this topic of what happened at the George Floyd Memorial. There was a section of basically of the town of Minneapolis that was set aside as a memorial to George Floyd. They put up barricades and they made it a police no-go zone, and this also interfered with medical workers being able to get to people in trouble, you know, paramedics and such. So anyway, in addition to that, not having police in the area made it a haven for criminals who knew that they weren't going to be pursued if they went in there.
This bill of comprehensive police reform to be... just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us. It sounds like gunshots. I'll let you know what this is. These seem to be gunshots. Shit. Shit, where is that?
We're okay, we're okay, we're okay.
We're just gonna go.
So that was the scene today at the George Floyd Memorial. Tragically, ironically, a gangland shootout, right at the site where people are honoring the memory of George Floyd on the anniversary of his death. Unfortunately, while this particular incident might get a little more attention because it's on the anniversary, it is part of a pattern of increased violence that has been taking place in that autonomous zone where the police are not allowed to be. This would go back to the defunding and abolishing the police doesn't seem to actually address the problems that take place, in regards to crime. So I took this clip here especially because this is the concerns of a couple of black business owners who live in the area who are having problems with their business because of the lack of police presence and the increase in violence. This was actually done on March 9th, 2021.
Where George Floyd died. Over the weekend, a man was shot in the nearby Uptown neighborhood, and a man died after being shot at 38th Street and Chicago Avenue. Reg Chapman has more from business owners at 38th in Chicago who are concerned about customer safety and a lack of resources to stay afloat.
After the incident that claimed George Floyd's life, 38th in Chicago has become known across the globe as a place of healing. Peace and respect are requirements to enter, but something has changed lately.
They don't feel safe. People are selling their homes. They hear gunshots. The police, they know the police not coming into the neighborhood.
Sam Willis owns Just Turkey. Willie Frazier owns Finished Touch Boutique, both businesses within feet of where George Floyd took his last breath, both now suffering from lack of customers because of the violence.
It can happen anytime. Yesterday, like you mentioned, it was 1 o'clock in the afternoon, over 20 shots fired. Lady and her 3 children ran into my restaurant.
2 of my customers had to get down on the ground yesterday because of gunfire.
The Free State of George Floyd is surrounded by barricades that these business owners believe protect the people who are doing wrong.
Well, they got the street closed off yet. They defined it, the police can't come in there. So whatever wrongdoing they did out here, outside the zone, once they make it to the zone, they're free. Police can't get them.
Minneapolis police have responded to incidents inside the zone and say it will continue to patrol the area in hopes of stopping the gunfire. Both Frazier and Willis want more to be done to protect lives and bring business back to the area.
You get shot in the zone, ambulance can't come in there. Nobody can come in there and get you. So I don't know if a building burned down, I don't know if they let a fire truck in there. They might let it burn down to the ground.
We know this is a prime location. You have visitors coming all across the world, and for them to experience gunshots and all type of violence is putting a black eye not only on our state, but let alone the city of Minneapolis.
So far, no financial help from the city. Both men feel abandoned by. Reg Chapman, WCCO 4 News.
So again, I thought anyway that supposedly removing police from the situation is supposed to make it more safe. I don't know who it makes it safer for, unless you're referring to the criminals who are now having an easier time of having shootouts. There was 2 articles that I looked at about this, and where George Floyd was killed, this is in the New York Times, solemn by day and violent by night. This apparently does not take into account the broad daylight gunfight that we just watched. But this was all the way back from July 29th, 2020. And basically 2 months after the police killing of George Floyd, the 4-block area of South Minneapolis, where he gasped his last breaths, remains a sacred space, a no-go zone for officers. There is a neatly trimmed garden anchored by a sculpture of a raised fist. There are colorful murals and the words "I can't breathe" painted across the pavement, as well as the names of the dozens of other black people killed by police. At night, though, the space is increasingly a battleground with shootings and drug overdoses. The area has had an uptick in gun violence similar to what other cities have seen in the wake of protests. At all times, the neighborhood brims with emotion. In its totality, it feels like the raw center of America's reckoning with racial injustice. The chaos at night has presented city officials with the challenge of how to reassert control of the space without setting off new waves of anger, all while maintaining it as a solemn place to honor Mr. Floyd in Ferguson, where the police killing of Michael Brown set off protests when officers moved to clear out a memorial. So basically they're trying to avoid, protesters trying to fight them about taking it down, but but in Minneapolis, at least for now, the city is moving cautiously. So it says, even so, elected officials are fielding a growing number of calls from residents concerned about the violence and loud noise at night in the area, where among several incidents, a pregnant woman was recently killed. Actually, this is a short article, so we'll zoom over to that, but this is the one that was linked here in the Star Tribune. Pregnant woman fatally shot in South Minneapolis. Baby delivered. A pregnant woman was shot Sunday night in South Minneapolis. This was on July 6th, and died after being rushed to a hospital. The woman's baby was delivered at HCMC and placed in the neonatal intensive care unit. There was no word in the newborn's condition, according to the police spokesman. Shots were heard about 9:15 p.m. near the intersection of East 37th Street and South Elliott Avenue. Officers found the woman inside a vehicle suffering from an apparent gunshot wound. Police have classified the woman's death as a homicide. No one has been arrested. So, coming back to here, what people aren't recognizing is that people who live there are having a very, very challenging time from the unlawfulness that is occurring after the sun goes down, or now, as I pointed out earlier, apparently also in broad daylight, said Andrea Jenkins, a member of the city council whose district includes the memorial space. Mind you, this is the same city council that voted to defund the police and then voted to refund the police, and had the gall to complain about the increase in crime that happened around that time, including like carjackings and such that all skyrocketed. But anyway, there are constant gunshots every night. Emergency vehicles can't get in. Disabled people are not able to access their medications, their appointments, their food deliveries, etc. It's a very challenging situation. Ms. Jenkins, who noted that the area has historically been plagued by gang violence, has also been taking a leading role in discussions over how to memorialize Mr. Floyd's killing. One proposal suggests making the garden permanent. Other ideas include a civil rights museum and renaming Chicago Avenue in honor of Mr. Floyd. So I guess, looking over all of this, it really just kind of comes down to the fact that you guys didn't want any police there. Now you have no police there.